Okay, so I'm going to get a bit old school on your ass. I think that's how you're supposed to say it. Today and make a rebuttal video to a channel called UK Christian Answers. Before I get on with the rebuttal, I always like to start with a bit of an ad hominem. So first I'd like to make fun of their intro. So let me play you their intro. And here is their intro. Isn't that kind of like an intro that was designed by committee there? It's as if two people have both thought, yeah, I'm going to design the intro for this channel. And then when it's come to it, they've clashed heads and they've both refused to fucking budge and said, no, my intro's going to be the intro. No, my intro's going to be the intro. Right, fuck it. I'll play it again. It's just like two separate intros. What the fuck is that? So anyway, this series of videos that Rob does, in which he kind of, it's if you've ever seen Ravi Zachariah always makes up these bullshit conversations that he's had with atheist students, or some atheist in the street has approached him and gone, oh, Mr. Zachariah, let me ask you this question. And he always, of course, bests, because it's very easy to best somebody when you haven't actually had that conversation to begin with.
And a student shot up out of his seat and he just shouted at me and he said, there cannot be a God because there's too much evil in this world. I said, remain standing, I'd like to interact with you. When you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled with that for a moment, because he knew he was possibly going into some quicksand.
But it's his mechanism of making his argument, and Rob has used this mechanism. To be fair to Rob, I don't think he expects us to actually think he's had these conversations with Richard Dawkins and Peter Atkins and Lawrence Krauss, but his videos are based on the idea that he's walked into this pub in Oxford with William Shakespeare, and William Shakespeare's really only a mechanism to allow Rob to make his bard joke, of course, but then Shakespeare leaves, and then Rob overhears a conversation in the first video between Peter Atkins and Richard Dawkins. So what has happened is Peter Atkins has been in conversation with Richard Dawkins. He's declared to Dawkins that he is an A-Swedenists, and Dawkins is starting to give his objections and give a list of evidences for the existence of Sweden, which so far has consisted of the Swedish chef and something else, I can't remember, off the Muppets and something else. So I'll start the segment running from there. See what you think.
And on a map, how do you explain what glues together Finland and Norway? I mean, this is a pretty staggering claim. I mean, where's your evidence? And Atkins, looking pretty incredulous, I have to say, he said, Richard, what do you mean evidence? And Dawkins just said, well, you must have more than just a hunch and some pretty impressive evidence to have come to this conclusion. And then Atkins, he got that sort of smug look on his face. You know, I didn't get that smug look. He just said, I can see your confusion, Richard. See, you think my denial of Sweden is a belief. No. It's simply a non-belief. And so I don't need to give you any evidence at all.
So before we get going with this, I just want to ask you to juxtapose these two things. On the one hand, we have Rob, who's creating these arguments, expecting us to believe that in some way he's bested the likes of Peter Atkins and Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss on an intellectual level. Juxtapose that alongside the fact that of these 4 videos he's made, it's only in the 4th and final video that he actually works out which way round to have his fucking camcorder. So it doesn't really inspire a great deal of confidence. This video then, he's made an argument. It's basically based on the old thing of burden of proof, isn't it? And the atheist claim that it's the theist that has the burden of proof. I don't really like the idea of burden of proof. I'd rather say the burden of evidence. So if I say burden of proof anymore in the video, just assume I mean the burden to provide some positive evidence, not to actually prove something beyond any kind of doubt in some kind of deductive sense. I just make that clear. And what he does is he has this idea of Sweden, and this Peter Atkins has this absurd position, which I'm sure Peter Atkins would never make, that he is an A-Swedenists, that he's not making a positive claim by saying that Sweden doesn't exist. So that is an acceptable way to engage. It's interesting. The whole business of cartography is quite interesting. I was quite lucky the other year because my father-in-law bought me this beautiful book, Cartographia, which gives you the history of map making around the world and some marvellous maps, some of the first maps that we have on record. And I want you to think about the fundamental business of cartography, which is that there are two ways that you can go about doing it. Let's talk about making a map of the world. If you know the world is a sphere, which we've known for a very long time, and the kind of dimensions, I think is about 16,000 miles all the way around, then there are two ways that you can go around the business of mapping that world. The first one that you can do is that you can just make shit up, can't you? You can maybe know, we know the United Kingdom, okay, and we knew parts of Europe. So what we could just start doing is just start drawing some land masses elsewhere, putting a few rivers on them, putting a few mountain ranges on them, and just make shit up, and then expect anybody else to accept that map. And if they don't want to accept that map, then they have the burden of proof to go out there and prove that this map that we've just made up is wrong. What's interesting if you read this book on map making is that that's not an approach that anybody has ever followed. What people have actually done, what cartographers have done, is they've expected people to go out there and survey, to go out there and see where the rivers actually are, to actually get some evidence for the coastline, to actually get some evidence for where the mountain ranges are, and to proceed from there. I think that's an eminently reasonable way of carrying on. I hope that Rob would agree with me on that point. I feel certain that Rob would agree if he was charged with the crime of murder, that he would expect the prosecution, that he would expect the presumption of innocent until proven guilty, that he would expect the prosecution to provide some positive evidence, that the onus would be on the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he had committed the crime, that he could have been in the right place at the right time, for example, to commit the crime, that he would have had a motive and a means to commit the crime, that the onus wouldn't be on Rob, and that the onus would only fall on Rob once some evidence had actually been made in the first place. I'm also sure that if we were to go back 1,000 years and I was to say to Rob, hey Rob, there's a country 7,000 miles away from here, I'm going to call it Australia. It's a huge great country with a big desert in the middle and these kind of giant kangaroo creatures that bound around on two legs that are as big as men, that he wouldn't just take that at face value, that he would expect me to provide some positive evidence for that. He wouldn't just take it at face value and say, well, I'm just going to accept it, unless that I can evidence the fact that this place doesn't actually exist. And here's the thing, Rob. When we're talking about claims of countries, you know, if we were taking this blank map of the planet, okay, and I was to say to you, I'm not going to fill anything in on the rest of the map because we don't know what exists here yet. We haven't sent out our boats yet to survey the rest of the globe, but I suspect that there's going to be some sea and there's going to be some land masses, okay? I think that would be a pretty reasonable claim. And the balance, the burden of proof, the balance of evidence there wouldn't be so far away that you wouldn't expect some positive contribution from both parties. But Rob's God claim isn't of that generic sort. It's a very, very specific claim. Rob believes in a God that sent down his son, who's also himself, so that we could murder his son. And he wanted us to murder his son because it was only through murdering his son that he could let us off for a sin that was never actually committed in the first place. A same God that doesn't like the fact that we masturbate in our bedrooms. This is a very specific God that Rob is bringing to the table. It's a very specific claim, so I think it behooves Rob to make very specific evidence. And this brings us on to the point where sometimes atheists do get this wrong. in my perspective, this balance, this burden of proof thing, which is that it only really applies until some evidence has been provided. Once some evidence has been provided, then it does behoove us as atheists to respond to that evidence. We can no longer just sit there and say, mine is just a lack of belief, I don't have to prove or evidence something. Well, maybe you don't from the outset. But once an argument has been made, that argument has to be addressed. Now, this could have been the point that Rob was trying to make, but the thing is, when he's talking about Peter Atkins and Richard Dawkins, he's talking about two individuals that have devoted very, very large portions of time to answering and objecting to the arguments, both philosophical and scientific, that Christians and other theists have brought to the table. So why would you want to strawman the argument that these people have made in the terms that you have? Well, okay, I think that's probably all we need to say with regard to this particular argument. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of what's going to be an ongoing series. In Rob's next video of his series, he went on to tackle Richard Dawkins on the subject of morality, along the lines that if there's no moral lawgiver, on what basis does Richard Dawkins make the moral statements that he makes? I'll be tackling that in a future episode of this series. I hope you'll join me for that episode. All that leaves me to do now is to say thank you for watching and bye for now. Thank you for watching and bye for now.